Harry, we're coming now to the end of this great trip to Jerusalem where Jesus shares so much of his gospel and his requirements with the apostles before his passion and resurrection. And we notice that as he approaches, he continues to share with them themes that are of considerable interest. He predicts his own passion once again, a theme that's about to be fulfilled at the end of 18. And then at the beginning of 19, we have another of those stories that we've seen so often where the issue of wealth and faithfulness come together. And that's the story of Zacchaeus. And how do you read those two, or especially the Zacchaeus story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly the passion prediction in Luke 18:31 parallels the kind of structuring element we get in both Mark and Matthew leading up to the passion story. And here we have it at this crucial juncture just before Jesus gets to Jerusalem, in effect. So we get these anticipations of the major action to come. The Zacchaeus story, it seems to me, it kind of brings to a culmination the important theme of wealth and poverty that Luke has been playing with. And we've seen Luke saying some radical things, right? You have to give up all you have and give to the poor and the like. Here he's confronted with someone rather like the dishonest steward that we encountered in the parable form
in some ways, that's
right. He's someone who has made good for himself by his civil service job.
Yeah.
And government in this case was a little corrupt, and Zacchaeus confesses it. And Jesus welcomes him and says he's going to dine with him, and as Zacchaeus promises restitution, and more than restitution, recompense for whatever he's done.
Yeah.
He doesn't, however, give up all that he has.
Right.
He's a little more like the soldiers and the tax collectors that John the Baptist addressed at the beginning of this whole ministry. And so there's a kind of bookending that goes on. John's preaching to those folk and Jesus preaching to Zacchaeus. And I think here we have an example of what I was talking about earlier on of the counsel of perfection, give all you have, give up all you have and give it to the poor. And the pastoral application of that counsel when you're confronted with a real case of someone who has repented for his sins. So it's interesting. This is one of those cases where it's both and. Luke is speaking out of both sides of his mouth,
simultaneously.
Articulating this important principle, but then adapting it to a specific situation. That, in any case, sets up the story for the entry into Jerusalem with the one last parable of the 10 pounds. Again, responsible use of wealth.
Absolutely.
Is the theme of chapter 19.
Yeah, absolutely.
And after talking about that, he gets into Jerusalem.
Do you think with Zacchaeus, when Jesus says you are a son of Abraham, what does he mean by that? Is it bringing him back into the covenant community? Saying that says of Zacchaeus, you're a son of Abraham.
Remember the Abraham theme in the opening chapters in the Magnificat and the Benedictus, and how what we have in Jesus is the story of the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham and his descendants forever. And this is something that's going to be at the heart of Luke's story going forward, that the life of the church is a fulfillment of the promises embedded in the prophets, promises to Israel, and Israel that's going to be expanded to include the Gentiles. And so part of this is bringing the lost sheep home.
Yeah.
We have echoes of the previous couple of chapters here.
We
Zacchaeus
do.
is a lost sheep.
He's
a prodigal son.
Coin.
And he's also somewhat of a dishonest steward.
And
in all of these cases, summed up by being embraced by Jesus, being given a new start, and by being told, yes, I'm dining in your house tonight. Dining, that a very important theme, and we're going to be picking up on that momentarily.
Okay. So here comes Jesus into Jerusalem. On his what's usually called the Triumphal Entry. Is this triumphal? What's going on? What themes do you see in here?
Yeah, just one thing to say about the overall structure here. In 1928, we have Jesus going into Jerusalem, and this begins the Lucan parallels to the Matthean and Markan accounts. Right. And so up until now, for the last 10 chapters or so, under this overall rubric of moving up to Jerusalem, we've had this hodgepodge of teachings brought together in some sort of spiraling thematic way. Right. And now we get back to the Markan order, because I think Luke is following Mark.
Yeah, I do too.
And some of the themes of Mark, the irony, for instance, of this entry into Jerusalem, riding on an ass, is this... an evocation of Davidic monarchy, or is it kind of an ironic comment on the monarchical or Davidic claims that can be made about Jesus? It's ambiguous.
Okay.
In any case, Jesus does enter and is acclaimed in hymnic form, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord,
Yeah.
peace in heaven and glory in the highest in heaven," echoing the proclamation of the angels at the birth of Jesus. There are all these parenthetical kinds of things at the beginning and the end of the gospel, echoes of things that Luke has already done. And that's in addition to the Mark inversion. In any case, from here on, what we get is more or less the story of Jesus in Jerusalem as Mark tells it, with a few twists and turns, a couple of additional elements, and then some rather dramatic reformulations, as in the eschatological discourse, the story of the last things.
Let's come to that. And just the one thing, other thing I was going to point out is that telling the daughters of Jerusalem that Jerusalem is going to collapse before their very eyes, which is, I think, in Luke only, right? And
That's right.
You and your children will not escape this.
Yep.
And then that leads into 21. So 21, which is the eschatological claim over Jerusalem, there's a version of this in Mark, version of this in Matthew. What does Luke do that shows us his particular emphases? And let me phrase the question a little differently. Again, in the standard histories, theologies of Luke, Luke is the one who postpones the end, talks about the time of the church. Yes, it's coming, but there's no big hurry about it, so we need to think about how we live in the meantime. Is this meantime stuff, or is this get ready, any minute, here he comes?
Yeah, I think it's more the meantime stuff. If you read the version of this set of prophecies in Mark, for instance, Mark 13, you get the sense that Jesus is talking about something that's going to happen in the very short run. And there were certainly a lot of early Christians who believed that Jesus was going to come back and there was going to be eschatological judgment within their own lifetime. Paul certainly believed that. And by the time that Luke was writing this gospel in the 80s or 90s, it's been quite a while since those first predictions were made, and people, I think, are beginning to worry about whether that belief is correct or whether they had to readjust their eschatological timetable. I think what you have in Luke is precisely that kind of adjustment. And it occurs around Luke 21:20, where you've had a series of predictions of end-time disasters of one sort or another, and also persecution for those who are going to be following Jesus. That's another element of this whole eschatological discourse. But here in 21:20, you have something that's unique to Luke. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. I think what Luke has done is to have taken a prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem as an end-time event.
Yeah.
And looking back on the events of 70 CE, when Jerusalem was in fact
So
surrounded
we're
by
putting Luke
armies.
20 years after
20
this,
years
something like that.
afterwards,
Yeah.
looks back on the events of 70, when the Romans put Jerusalem under siege and eventually destroyed it.
Right.
Looks back on that and says that is a prophecy that Jesus made. He knows of the tradition of this prophetic text, but it wasn't something for the final time. It was a prediction of the war that we have experienced. So that enables you to put a kind of broader time frame within the general eschatological perspective here. And I think you see that at the end of this little story in verse 24, this part of the prophecy in verse 24, where Luke has Jesus say, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles, the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So how long are the times of the Gentiles?
Right.
However long it takes for them to be fulfilled. And that's a hint that you don't have in the other Gospels.
Yeah. And Acts is in some ways the story of the beginning of the times of the Gentiles.
Times of the Gentiles, exactly. And so Luke has the hope that eventually the Son of Man will come like a thief in the night and all of that. But that's something out in the far distant future.
Yeah. So in the meantime, you get the church? Does that?
In the meantime, you get the church. You know, as the wags used to say, Jesus predicted the coming of the kingdom of God, and what happened was the church.
The church,
Luke, I think
that's all right.
Yes.
I think the wags thought that was a terrible come down.
Right.
I think Luke thinks that's all right, that the time of the church. The time of the church, I think, for Luke anticipates the time of the kingdom. It's not just a letdown.
In a
from the
very
kingdom.
significant way, and I want to point to one of the ways in which that happens, because one of the other things that Luke does here in this body of material on Jesus in Jerusalem is to tell the story of Jesus' Last Supper.
Yeah.
And he tells it in a way that is somewhat distinctive. That is, where the other Gospels have Jesus saying a word over the bread at this Passover Seder, and then over the cup equating the bread with his body and the cup with his blood.
Yeah.
Luke highlights another saying over a cup before Jesus gets to the bread. And he has Jesus saying, I've eagerly desired, this is in chapter 22, verse 15.
Yeah.
I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Another passion prediction.
Yeah.
For I tell you, I will not eat it again, the eating motif,
Yeah.
not eat it again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom
Yeah.
of God. And then he goes on and blesses the first cup. And he gives another vow or prediction. I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. What happens at the end of the gospel?
Meals.
After
Meals galore.
Jesus' resurrection,
Yeah.
he eats and
Yeah.
drinks with
Yeah.
his disciples.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that Luke is signaling by highlighting these vows, which
Yeah.
we find in the other Gospels too, but not in this
Not in the
this
same
prominent way,
power. That's right.
that what happens in the resurrection and the birth of the church is the start of the fulfillment
Yeah.
of end times. So there's, in some ways, a kind of overlap between these times of the Gentiles and
That's
the times
nice.
of the fulfillment of prophecy.
That's nice. Because I think for contemporary 21st century Americans, we think Eucharist banquet is something you do at the end of the church service, and for Luke, it's the beginning of the kingdom.
That's right.